Hello, I'm Mike Coward, and I've got an exciting subject to talk to you about today. It is the spirit in which Jesus operated every day of his life, and it's called humility. Now, I know you're not getting excited about humility, but you just wait. We're going to find out that there is great strength, power, and authority that lies in humility. So if you will, get your Bibles out, get your computers on, get your notepad out, whatever you do to take notes, and get ready to go into a study of the Word with me on this episode of Mike's Morning Message. Well, God bless you for taking a few moments and just being with me for a time in the study of the Word. And as I told you on my intro, we're going to be talking about humility today. It's something that has been in my spirit now for some time, and something I wished I'd availed myself of more in my earlier ministry. A few months back, the state office for our denomination called me, and they asked me if I would come to a location, a church in Brunswick, and do a video interview. They are doing a series they call the Legacy Series, in which they're interviewing older, retired ministers. And I may be retired, but I don't put myself in that category. But anyway, they wanted to interview us. They were going to ask us like 3 or 4 questions, talk about your salvation experience, talk about your call to preach, how you got in the Church of God. They wanted you to tell them about a significant moment in your ministry that you remembered that really impacted you, and so on. So I went down there to do that interview and got into the process of it. And as we got toward the end of it, the young gentleman that was interviewing me, he said, "Pastor, I have one more question I want to ask you." He said, "Brother Coward, if you could go back to the 18-year-old Mike Coward when you started preaching and speak to him and give him any advice, what would you tell him and what would you say to him?" And I'll be honest with you, it messed with me for a moment. I've been preaching since I was 18. I've been preaching for 52 years now, and I thought about if I could just in a moment step back and see myself, and what would I say to myself. And to be honest, I knew immediately what I would say to myself, but it overwhelmed me, so I had to get my composure to give them the answer. But I looked at him and I said, if I could go back and tell my 18-year-old self anything, I would tell him humility. Everything you do, everything you say, all your actions, all your deeds, all your intentions, let them come out of a spirit of humility. I would look at him and tell him, this is not about you. It will never be about you. This is about the kingdom. This is about Christ. This is about souls. And I would tell him that if he operated in humility, it would safeguard him from many pitfalls and mistakes and stumbles that he inevitably has made in his life. And when I got through with that, I drove home, and I'll be honest with you, it messed with me. Because if I could do anything in my life and go back to it, I would go back and do my best to operate out of a spirit of humility. My mentor, May Terry, and if you've ever heard me preach or you've sat under my teachings, you know I've spoke of her often. When I was first getting into ministry, and I would go sit under her preaching every time I could. And then when I started pastoring, I would bring her to my church wherever I was and have her preach. And there was something she would always do when she would get up to preach. She'd talk for a moment, she'd stand behind that pulpit, and then she'd reach forth and put her hands on that pulpit she'd say, I want to pray. And she'd say it in that deep voice of hers, and she'd go through this prayer. But inevitably, somewhere in that prayer, maybe toward the end, but she would say these words: hide me behind the cross of Calvary and lift up the blood-stained banner of Jesus and let Jesus be glorified. When I first heard her say those words, I didn't fully understand them, but here I am 70 years later, and I understand fully what she was doing. And many times when I would get up to preach now, I do the same thing and I say the same thing. I want to be able to be hid if I could. It's so much about preaching. People focus on you and they look at you and they see the man in the pulpit and watch his styles, his mannerisms, and so on. And they get focused on him. But what she was praying was, Lord, don't let them see me. Let them see the cross of Calvary. Lift up the bloodstained banner of Jesus. Let them see the price that he paid for our salvation. And what she was doing was a great act of humility. When Paul was writing to this church, this Philippi church, you have to understand he's in prison. He's in a prison cell writing this, and it's not a cell like you think, but I don't really have time to get into that. But he was in a very cramped cell that you couldn't even stand up in. You just had to sit in or kneel in. And he's not really writing. There's a hole through which they let him down into that cell, and someone sitting above him with parchment paper and pen and ink, and they're writing and he's dictating to them, and they're taking every word he says and they're writing it down. And he's writing to this church that he loves dearly. And listen to what he said. And this is Philippians chapter 2 and verse 1. And really listen to these words. We're going to read down through about verse 4. And then we're going to really start to break down what he was talking about when he talks about Jesus and his humility. But listen as he leads into this. He says, therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, and you must understand, Paul knew where his encouragement came from. It didn't come from people surrounding him, pushing him on, saying, go, you're doing great, Paul. His encouragement came even when he was sitting in a jail cell, a cramped jail cell. No one there to encourage him, but his encouragement came because he was united with Jesus. And I'm going to tell you, beloved, in this day and time, that's where your encouragement has to come from. It can't come from the things of the world, and not even from people. You've got to know of your unity with Jesus. But let me read on. He said, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, and that's where Paul got his comfort from. Not whether anybody was there to comfort him, but his comfort came because he knew Jesus loved him. If any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete. This pastor, this bishop, this man this church was birthed out of, he says, I want you to make my joy complete. If you have any of these gifts, tenderness, compassion, love, encouragement, he said, make my joy complete. And then he tells them how. By being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit, and of one mind. Like-minded, having the same love. He didn't say loving the same things, but he's saying have the same kind of love. And that's what Christians have to really rely upon in their own life. Not that we all love the same things, because we don't. But we have the same kind of love, the agape love of God working in our life. And that's how we love one another in spite of all our differences. We still love one another deeply. But he said, if you have this, He said, make your joy complete. He said, make my joy complete. He said, be like-minded, being of one spirit and one mind. And that's a tall order. That's a tall order to ask Christians. I want y'all to be like-minded. Good gracious. I want you to think alike. I want you to have the same mind. And again, not like the same things or think upon those same things, but we're talking about spiritual matters here. Not earthly, spiritual matters. And all this that he's asking them to do, being one in spirit and one in mind, he gives them the formula for how to do it. And here it comes. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. He says your motivation, what you're motivated to do, what you're inspired to do, what you're prompted to do, what you desire to do. He said it has to be done not out of selfish ambition. In other words, you don't do it for yourself. You don't do it to motivate or to elevate yourself. You remember when the disciples were discussing one time about who was the greatest in the kingdom and who's going to sit on the right, left, yada, yada. Jesus looked at them and he said, listen, the Gentiles, he said, they're always trying to get ahead of one another and get on top of one another and beat one another. And I'm paraphrasing. He said, but don't let that be named among you. He said, if you want to be the greatest, become the least. He said, you've got to learn to be a servant. He said, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Conceit. And Paul had to deal with conceit. All these great revelations that he was getting from God, all this inspiration he was getting from the Lord, and visions and being called up into the third heavens. And he said, because of these surpassing great revelations, he said, to keep me from becoming conceited, a messenger of Satan was sent to buffet me. And you know the story. And you know how a thorn in the flesh, he called it. And how he prayed for God to relieve him of it. But he never got relief, but he got revelation. Beloved, if you can learn that sometimes you don't need relief, you need revelation. You need understanding of why God's allowing things to happen in your life and why your life is going the way that it's going. And even Paul had to deal with that spirit of conceit. And he says to the Philippians, don't ever do anything out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. And listen to him, rather, in humility, value others above yourself. Value others. The worth, the importance, the significance you place on others. Value it above yourself. I have to confess that I've been so guilty of the opposite of that in my life at times. Before I became my own pilot and had my own plane and I was flying myself everywhere I wanted to go, I'd travel on commercial airlines and even still do when I would be going overseas to India or wherever. But one of the things I loved to do was sit in an airport and watch people. I'm telling you, there's some strange people come through an airport. And I'd watch them and I'd try to evaluate them and evaluate their life or who they were, or what they were doing. And to be honest, it was conceit doing that. And the Lord stopped me one day about that. And he said, what are you doing? He said, you don't know that person. You don't know what they're going through. You don't know what they're facing in their life. And I realized then that I wasn't valuing others above myself. If anything, I was putting something below me because I didn't think they were at my level of spirituality or whatever. But we get into that. And Paul said, no. He said, you do nothing out of vain conceit or selfish ambition, but rather, and here it is, and this is the key to it, in humility, value others above yourself. And that's the only way you can value anybody above yourself, is you have to do it through a spirit of humility. And if I know you sit there and you go, well, it's a hard thing to do. Well, it is. It is sometimes a hard thing to do, to put people above you all the time. And listen to me. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. Humility is thinking of yourself less. Not as much, not as often, in other words. That's how you begin the process of valuing others above yourself, as you think of yourself less. And then he goes to verse 4 and he says, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of the others. In other words, you don't look at it and say, what's in it that's best for me? But you look at it and you say, what's in it for the best interest of others? Not looking to your own interest, the things that interest you, the things you think are valuable or worthy of your time. He said, not to your own interest, but to the interest of others. Look at how you can look to what is the interest of others. If you came up in my day and time, you know who Mr. Rogers is, Fred Rogers. I watched a movie about him with Tom Hanks playing him and him being interviewed. And the whole movie was about this man that was interviewing him and how Fred Rogers impacted his life. And Fred Rogers was a minister of the gospel. And how he impacted this man's life and how it changed this man. I watched that movie and I saw how everything that Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, did with this man was he looked to the interest of this man, not his own interest. Even though this man was trying to interview him and put him up front to be seen, he got so involved with this man, looking into his life and trying to help him get over things he was dealing with in his own personal life. And I'll be honest, it convicted me so. I said, Father, my goodness, if I could go back and change anything about my life, I would want to go back and be more involved in looking to the interest of others rather than of myself. And I'm going to give you one more verse, verse 5, and then I've got to stop for today. But he comes down in verse 5 and he says, in your relationships with one another. And you have to understand something. The life that we live is a relational life. It's meant to be built on relations. From the moment we come from our mother's womb, our life is to be built on relations. Our relationship, first of all, with our mother, and then our father, our parents, and then siblings that come along, and relationships with family, relationships with friends, relationship with neighbors. Mr. Rogers in his neighborhood. And even the casual meeting of people, your relationship with them. I know in my years of being 70 years old now, I guess I'm mellowing and it's beginning to help me to do this more, but I'm finding myself more and more now getting involved in other people in the sense of wanting to know how they are, what they're going through. Not if they're necessarily a Christian or they go to church. I look at their life and I get involved trying to talk to them and help them and speak into their life. And inevitably it turns into a spiritual thing, but because I get looking into what they're interested in their life. I was standing in a parking lot today and a young lady got out of her car. She was in uniform. She turned out to be a deputy sheriff with the Chatham County Sheriff's Department up in Savannah, but she lived down here in Hinesville, and I just spoke to her. She was walking by, and she spoke back, and I asked her about the place where she was living. It was in an apartment complex, and before it was over with, I had talked to her for 20 minutes. She told me she was wanting to get her own home, and I found myself talking to her like I would be talking to my daughter and giving her encouragement and advice simply about buying a home. And she's 22 years old, single, and looking to buy her first home. Beforehand, I never did get that involved with somebody like that, but now I'm learning that it's about being involved in other people's lives more than your own life. It's about letting humility guide you in your relationships with people and how you can look to the interest of others, not your own interest. And I'm going to make a confession to you. You preachers don't do this a lot because they don't want members to know they think like this. But, there was a time when you would look at people coming into your church and you would think, oh, I wonder if they're wealthy. I wonder how much they'll tithe, or if they're going to be a good contributor, or if they're a good worker, The first thing we were doing, we were looking to how that person could help our interest rather than how we could help their interest. Beloved, that's the opposite of humility. That's the opposite of a Christ-like spirit. Well, I've gone long enough today. I'm going to continue on in our next study, and we're going to pick up where Paul talked about in your relationship with others to have the same mind that Christ did, and we're going to really get into the depth of the humility of Christ. So right now, just let me have a word of prayer with you. Father, thank you today for those that are watched by way of internet, whether on Facebook or YouTube, and thank you for giving them an ear to hear and a heart to receive and a mind to understand. Help them today, Father. You know their life. You know what they're going through. You know their needs. And Father, you are concerned about them. So let them know it, Father. Bless them and help them in all they do. Until next time. Well, thank you again. And until I see you the next time, if you'll pray for me, I'll pray for you.